So I was originally born in Japan, and I was there till about, I think, 4 or 5, near Tokyo. And I grew up, but then I moved to the Netherlands at a young age, like
Was this like a
preschool.
military thing or just your
No,
parents just traveling?
my sort of dad's side of the family, or my father's got my father got into art, kind of exhibition organizing and curation in different forms. And our base was ended up kind of temporarily being in the Netherlands. Um, One of his specialties or focus ended up becoming like 17th century Dutch masters, kind of golden age. Somehow ended up in the Netherlands for a while, and I also briefly lived in the UK. Spent a lot of time growing up over in Netherlands as well. Speak a little bit of Dutch. I Yeah, then we moved to uh, the West Coast. I was in San Francisco for a while growing up, and then I moved back to Japan. Moved back to Tokyo for a couple of years, and then moved back to the States. And then I was in New York for a while, and now I'm sort of back in San Francisco. So
Nice.
a lot
So
of moving
a lot of
around.
traveling as like through your adolescence and stuff as well, it sounds like. Do you have a reflection on that as having like, a positive impact, or was it challenging? Like, if and when you have kids, if you don't already, is that something that you think is like, you'd be interested in doing with your family, like moving around quite a bit, like internationally, or how do you think about that? Just because it's fairly unusual, I would say, right?
Yeah, I think it's definitely fairly not sort of staying in the same place for many years. Like that's for sure. The thing that I is really nice is I speak sort of, you know, multiple languages and feel comfortable in generally grok the culture, whether I'm in the States or whether I'm in Europe or more parts of Europe, I would say, or whether I'm in Japan or parts of East Asia. I sort of have a sense of what is normal. It feels so. I guess the good part is I feel at home in many of those places. The bad part is I have too many homes, and I don't know. You're kind of you have too many places that you have ties to. You don't know how to spend your time. So
Mm.
there's a difficulty in that for sure. There's also like a negative way to look at that would be your identity is fragmented and you don't have a home. But I'd like to think of it as I have too many homes and I don't know what to do about it. Is really I don't have enough time in one lifetime to fully immerse myself in each of those places and call it home, even though I would like to in some capacities. So that's difficult as
Yeah,
far as yeah. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's interesting. I have this sort of, so are you in San Francisco 100% now? Like, most of the year, like 90% of the year, besides vacations or travel or whatever, you're in San Francisco?
Yeah, I also have 2 kids, and
Oh, you
the
do have kids.
that's
Okay.
I do have kids. Yeah, I have 2 kids, and that has made yeah. So there's a whole other discussion about what does it mean to move them around and all this other stuff. So yes, I'm
Yeah.
mostly here.
So, the thing that I've been thinking about for the last probably 2 or 3 years a lot. It's interesting. Like, I was thinking about remote work quite a bit before COVID, and obviously, like, there's tons of people who were already working remote before COVID. Nowhere near as many that are doing so now, but a lot of people, like a non-trivial percentage of the world or whatever.
Yeah,
Especially like as a percentage of like information workers or whatever, if you will. And so it
yeah,
was like very much a thing, but it was not like top of mind for most people. And but I was thinking about it. I applied with some like very remote focused company to YC in like winter of 2019, I think it was, and then like, it got rejected, and then COVID hit. I was like, well, it might have actually been a pretty good idea for you, but in retrospect, I'm glad that that didn't work out.
Yeah.
But I was always thinking about it, and like it was always intriguing to me, just sort of that like freedom and ability to manage one's time, in terms of where they work, when they work, where they live, ultimately, etc. And I think this big thing that, like, I think COVID is still the impact of COVID in terms of the sort of step shift to remote work. And I know, the shift got kind of, it was like sort of if the step towards remote work was like X percent, then, maybe the shift back, or sort of like the rebound, was maybe like a third of X or half of X. So it wasn't like, it went really extreme for a little bit and then sort of came back to the middle, but it didn't go back to like where it was at all. Like it's still like way more remote than it was pre-COVID. And I think the
Right.
sort of like ultimate like ripple effects of that shift are still like very, very underestimated, in terms of how they might change how we work and how we live and where we live, and the makeup of various cities and rural areas and countries and states and everything. And one of the biggest reasons for that, in my view, is like, well, the more obvious one, which is probably roughly like, well, approximated in terms of like its impact, is this general trend of shift towards like less big cities. So like people moving from like a New York and a San Francisco to, I don't know, like Denver, or just like these cities that strike a little bit more of a balance in terms of like nature, and you're probably not going to be like in quite as small of a square footage apartment and whatever, because you might not, like, the smartest people don't have to be in those tier A1 cities for like the cream of the crop jobs anymore. They can still get the cream of the crop jobs and go and live in a place that just matches like sort of the lifestyle that they want, uh, better than maybe like a New York or a San Francisco might for some people. And of course, there'll still be people that'll choose those, but it'll just sort of like be less extreme, I think. And so, we saw that happen with a lot of these like sort of migrations in the years since COVID. But I think the lesser appreciated thing is that, not only are you not tied to New York if you want to work, cream of the crop finance job, or San Francisco if you want to work cream of the crop technology job, but you're not actually tied to like one city at all. It's like you don't have to just go leave San Francisco and live in Denver. Like that is something that you can do, but you can also live, and this is why I bring it up, is because your point about like having multiple homes. Like I've been extremely intrigued by this concept that maybe some percentage of the population, it's not going to happen all at once, but like some percentage of the population might shift from what is currently, I would say, like the just, default, like absolute, everyone basically effectively lives this way, which is that they have, one home and in one city in one state, or one town in one state or whatever. And that's where they spend, almost all of their year, outside of, a couple of vacations or one vacation and some business travel or whatever. And then, what are the exceptions to this rule? Digital nomads, who are sort of like the opposite extreme, who have like no homes, they're traveling kind of all the time. And then another one would be, pretty wealthy people who have like a second home. So someone who lives in, the Northeast, but has a winter home in Florida, or, LA, or someone who has a beach house, or like there's sort of a few different common sort of breeds of this thing. But my thinking is that basically, with the sort of severance of the tie between where one works and the fact that they have to live there, basically year round, I think, independent of that sort of like forcing function, a lot of people will actually choose to live in multiple places throughout the year. The thing is, you then run into sort of the last remaining tie. If you cut the occupation tie, like to a physical workplace, there is one more kind of that remains, which is your kid's school. And so if you continue to sort of like give the benefit of the doubt to this like sort of trend that I'm suggesting, I actually think that there will be sort of, and you also sort of consider how, public schools generally are being considered like not as good as they should be probably in America, or maybe as good as they used to be, or as good as other countries' education is. And I sort of expect some kind of innovation in schooling regardless. And so I expect that some like subsect of that change may be something that allows for this sort of like dynamic form of living. So I don't know if like any of that resonates at all, but basically my like shorthand for it has been calling it like seasonal living. And it goes that term sort of goes beyond just what we're describing here as well in terms of like having multiple homes in multiple places. But the core idea is that, you could, for example, spend 3 months in Japan and, 6 months in San Francisco and 3 months in the Netherlands every year on like a rotational cycle if you want, or maybe you carve out one of those months for just like miscellaneous travel or something. But I think like absent the need to be in one place year round, I think there is an appetite from especially like relatively young, independent minded, sort of curious, exploratory inclined people to live in this somewhat different way, at least for a period of time. And maybe doing it in a period of time that you're sort of an adult, but before you have kids is like sort of will satisfy that itch for people like me potentially. But maybe not. And maybe it's something that you choose to do even once you have kids and even once they're in school, if you can sort of find a way to work that out. So I don't know if you have thoughts on any of that, but it's just something that comes to mind mainly because you talk about just having sort of like multiple homes type concept. Might be on mute.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing that comes to mind is, first of all, just because you have kids, or it really independent of kids, I think that you can kind of do anything however you really want to do it. You can have kids and travel the world with them. You can homeschool them. There's multiple ways to do really anything, I think. So there's no one set way. That being said, there are inertial pulls toward certain behaviors. For example, if you don't, for let's say you don't have a job and you don't have to care for having a job, whether it's financial or just mentally or otherwise, you would still have this inertial pull to not to sort of work less on whatever it is that you're doing. I presume you'd be doing something on the weekends, less than you would do stuff on the weekdays. But you're not working, you don't have any obligations towards anyone, but there's still this sort of
Right.
pull. And you can kind of choose to do these things. You have to go against the system increasingly. You start to figure out is not designed for these outlier behaviors. So it is a lot of work, I think, to go against some of these things. And kind of how I generally like to think about it is, what do I really care about? And what am I going to spend the time? I think it's with companies as well in some ways. You almost get these like innovation credits. Like, where are you actually going to innovate? Where are you actually going to do things differently than what other people have done in the past? And I think it's the same with having family or anything. You get to do things differently, but if you do things differently, it's a lot more work. It requires resources and energy. It's not impossible. It's just is more work. So default settings are definitely easier. You kind of do the default setting for, I found myself doing about 80% is just, let's just do the default setting. It's actually quite I actually don't care as much as I initially thought. And then about 20%, I'm sort of would like to make bets of things that I truly believe in. Of course, I wish I
Right.
had time and resources. It's really time is I think the biggest gating factor to be honest, because I have limited RAM and limited bandwidth in general. So that becomes more the hurdle to overcome, and I have other things I need to do. So you kind of just it starts like 80% is kind of on autopilot, and I think a lot of people most things are on autopilot, which is also fine. I think people just kind of gravitate towards what they think they should do or what they're just told to do, and they're happy to do it. I am more skeptical of everything constantly, I suppose. So I want to know things. I want to think about things. Yeah, and that kind of I need to think things through, even if I just end up in the default path. So
Yeah, and I think it's it's interesting you bring up the sort of parallel to like companies thinking about um what did you call it?
innovation
Uh
credits, I guess. It's
innovation
essentially
credits.
yeah. Where
Yeah,
can you have like limited number of innovation credits within this period of time. You can't innovate on everything. Like if you innovate everything, you will
it
lose.
won't work. Yeah,
Yeah,
it won't work. So I think I've called this like risk budget. It's the same thing
yeah,
basically.
yeah.
And it's interesting making that analogy here. And I think I don't know how this will necessarily return to it, if this would make sense when you return it to a company, through the company analogy, but just to sort of like play with the idea for a second. I
Sure.
completely agree with you that these to go against the default takes roughly, let's call it effort. You mentioned that it sort of like ultimately comes down to time. I think someone could argue that wealth could also be a substitute for time in some cases. So something that might take time might not take time if you can just pay for it. And so
Of
sometimes
course.
it can be an equation of sort of one or the other. And I would say certainly that this thing that I'm talking about, living in multiple places, consistently, let's say having 3 homes per year for the price of one. The key term there is like the price of one, because if you want to just have 3 homes that you rotate throughout the year and you have infinite money, that's a trivial problem. You just go buy 3 houses, like you're good to go.
Yeah.
What
Well,
becomes
also
hard?
not trivial though, because I do think that the as you increase your infrastructure of things that you need to manage, also the management comes with maintenance and other fees and other overhead that maybe is not initially
True.
expected. And it is the sort of as your infrastructure that you need, it's kind of like the body. Like as initially it was you only you have to take care of the brain, you have to keep running the brain. That's really it. But then you need all these other organs and all the other infrastructure to manage just having a brain that can make decisions. It
Huh.
ends up
Yeah.
starting to add up.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate the maintenance point. But again, I think that even, for it goes back to the original thing, which is that um, you can pay someone to do the maintenance on everything as well. Like, and then you have to work, you have to manage them. So like ultimately,
Yeah.
yes,
It,
there may be more time, but like
I think
it's definitely
I do have yeah,
helpful. Yeah. The
definitely
basically the
helpful.
yeah.
But I will say one thing is I've definitely seen like this is like for example, I've seen some friend who spends most of their time has multiple kids, has multiple, pretty well off, like has multiple kids and has multiple. I think they're based in Dubai, and I think they literally called them slaves. I wouldn't use that term per
Wow.
se, but they have people who are like helpers, right? And they're still somehow stressed out about who's watching who and how are they going to handle this and it's just kind of funny to see in a way that there is a change, but because as the infrastructure grows, you're managing more things and you're still stressed out. You still have to trust people and you don't know if they'll do a good job. You don't know if they're getting the attention and the worries are eerily similar.
Yeah. I take that point for sure.
Yeah. But I agree. I think
And
there's a ton of things that money simplifies as well. So it's kind of, it's like money improves things that already exists, I would say. So it just kind of it increases it accelerates things sometimes, but it's not a substitute for direction.
right. Yeah, I agree with that. And so,
Yeah.
um, coming back to the specific example, I
Yeah.
was like, with living in multiple places for in a year for the price of one, it becomes, if you don't have that lever to pull, that you just buy a few houses, um, then the alternative is like you got to figure some stuff out, that there are not easy systems to make happen. So like the thing that I was thinking through previously was, how do you make it easier for people to sublet their place, so that, like, subletting is sort of this somewhat stigmatized thing still for some reason, even though it's basically, I mean, Airbnb started as like roughly a subletting thing, and then it became like pretty quickly something where most people who have Airbnbs, I don't have like the stats on this, but just my general like anecdotal feel from being someone who's stayed in a bunch of Airbnbs
Yeah.
is that they're almost, I think like 80 to 90% of those that I've stayed in have been seemingly like professionally run Airbnbs where this wasn't someone's home. Even out of the other, the one that came to mind that was in the 10 or 20%, it wasn't like sort of a professional Airbnb person, but it was someone who had a second house on their property that they were never living in the second house. The second house was strictly for Airbnb. So like it's these
Yeah.
properties that are dedicated to be Airbnbs versus originally it was like, the whole Airbnb breakfast thing is like someone opening their living room up to a stranger or
Yep.
something like this. And as Airbnb has evolved into more of this like sort of professionalized thing, the original thing is kind of harder to come by. And I think the original thing, is interesting from the host perspective, that it's interesting for the guests because you can find like sort of a less expensive place to stay. But for the host, it's an opportunity to like not have this dedicated space that you're Airbnb all the time, but to be able to sublet your place out for, 4 weeks, 3 months, whatever sort of the period might be, and to then have sort of that budget. Like, let's say you can just offset your rent costs or your mortgage costs, then you sort of have this like your budget, your monthly budget that you're accustomed to spending off of whatever income or savings that you have. You then have like that back in your pocket to allocate freely and return to your status quo whenever you're done with that little period. And maybe you're open to sort of like increasing that budget for a little bit so you can go travel somewhere that maybe you couldn't afford to live for 12 months out of the year. Or maybe you actually use it to save money and you go and live really cheaply for a month or two or three or whatever. And these are like, as we're talking about, even I'm like, man, it's like, it's a lot of work. We
Yep.
don't really have great systems for these things. And I think, um, to your point on like just the amount of, people, whether there's an appetite for these things or not, the amount of work required sort of squashes that appetite in terms of how much of it actually gets, comes to fruition. And I think possibly, this is just maybe one way of one angle on it, but it might be that if you can find things that have like this really high sort of hidden appetite where you can't really see it happening because it's hard, but you see a smaller number of people going to great efforts to overcome the amount of friction and the effort that's required, sort of like against all odds and against like this very powerful default. That might sort of suggest, like, if you see that happening an increasing amount, which I'm not saying it's happening for what I'm saying, but just as sort of a generalization, I wonder if, if you see that happening, then you sort of decide, okay, is there something we can do in the form of like a business, for
Yeah.
example, or
Yeah.
even
So
at a government level in terms of policy to make this easier? You might see like an explosion and you're able to, that's, if you see people are able to do this thing that they want to do more, that's like a very, that's value for them. And then you capture a bit of that value in the form of sort of like a business revenue or a, if it's a government, maybe like taxes or whatever. And that's sort of like an interesting sign to look out for. So that's more of like the category that I would put like what I'm talking about here. Like I completely agree with you. It's really hard right now to do it in the way that I'm describing, at least.
yeah.
Again,
Yeah.
if you don't have the money for like three
But
houses or whatever. But I think my hunch is that there is an appetite for it, if for no other reason than I think if you look around and you like sort of ask friends and family, I could be wrong about this, but I think people are spending less time out of the year in their primary residence, and they're just eating the double rent on these vacations they're taking or family that they're visiting or whatever. And if you're visiting family, obviously it's not really double rent. You're not paying for where you are, but you're still paying back home. I just think people are like taking advantage of this remote work to be in different places for a higher percentage of the year. And again, it's just sort of anecdotal.
I agree.
But
I
I
agree.
wonder what happens if something comes in and makes that easier for a lot of people.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is this is probably a phenomena that I feel like I've seen a lot in, at least from my perspective, in San Francisco and sort of like New York.
Yeah.
I've seen in LA as well, to a certain extent, and other, other places like Denver and parts of Texas and things like this. Generally speaking, it's a very, you know, like you have to kind of be already pretty well off to even consider that this is an option. I think the majority of people in the world are not still thinking in these terms. Also, the majority of people are still not working even remote jobs to begin with. So, but
Right.
that being said, I do think for this higher kind of percentage socioeconomic folks, I do think that trend is happening. I think that the sort of larger overall thing that I've also noticed is, in the past, you can go back pretty far, but even just taking like the past 100 years, for example, I think there's this slow decoupling of values and uh, kind of things that used to be done by the church or by the state are kind of being cut off, and the responsibility is moving from the state or the church or other institutions to individual decision decision making. And
Hmm.
I think the I almost feel like it's starting to get actually really difficult to manage. So on one hand, one of the great things about freedom, in not freedom as in free beer, but freedom as in sort of choice and being able to make decisions, is that you have the freedom to choose kind of like what you want. And I think that's one of the principles that obviously the United States is built upon. And but that's the sort of the other side of the coin to that is with freedom comes responsibility. So as you have more and more things
Right.
that you can choose, you have more responsibility to make these decisions. And I think increasingly there's kind of like a local maxima for people who are decently sort of, like living in places like San Francisco and New York, I would say that are well off, but um, not like able to buy three houses, right? That you can just live in three places. I'm just taking that as an example. Are there's too much choice. Like there's too many things that you need to decide and you need to choose. And I think increasingly it's not just this sort of demographic, but increasingly individuals are being forced to make decisions essentially that institutions have. And part of it is because institutions, 90% of the people, 90 plus percent of the people, it serves decently well most of the time. But because of the small percentage, it isn't working. So we need to kind of like rehash the system, get rid of it, and then have people individually choose so they can make their choices. That being said, I think it's becoming this decision fatigue because we're just so inundated with, whether it's everything from taxes to all these SaaS settings we have to make, or I go into Instagram and be like, I don't, or not Instagram, but some service and be like, I don't want you to train. It's like here, we're giving you the choice to choose whether you want to be trained on the images that you generate or not. And it's like I have to make those decisions every single time. This is decision and information fatigue kind of sold to you as freedom in a way. And I think it's increasing only. So I think it kind of falls into the bucket is there's like things that people want to do, but the sort of way to navigate not just the bureaucracy, but this sort of modern life is just increasingly fraught with more freedom to choose. But that freedom to choose is, I think, in a way, paralyzing people into essentially inaction because they just can't handle it most of the time. Not all of it, essentially. Not like they can't handle their lives and they can't move forward, but like a lot of it just gets lost. So I think somehow, I don't know exactly how, but I think there's a way to tie this desire to kind of do these things that are sort of more increasingly out of the norm, with helping people navigate this information overload and decision overload that everyone is inundated with, and you know, yeah. So anyway, I have a lot of thoughts on the consequences of that, and other sort of issues that are happening. Things like low birth rates and people moving to cities and other things. But anyway, I'll just leave it at there for now. Oh, are you muted?
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Hey, sorry about that. So I was saying I think it's it's a great point, and it's something that I've thought about as well. I forget like word for word what I said, but I remember I had this tweet at some point that was like, I don't remember exactly what it was, but I'm a great example of what you're talking about. First of all, I think it is sort of a general phenomenon that, this sort of freedom and ability to make various decisions for yourself is increasing. And then I would put myself at sort of like the extreme end of that, in that, I've taken time outside of like, basically unemployed after my first job. And then after my second job, at this point, like I've spent probably, roughly a third of my time since graduating college unemployed. And that's sort of, if you're not tied to a specific place, you're not working a specific job, you don't yet have kids. This is like a very free sort of situation, right?
Yep.
And so, I've dealt with what you're talking about, where on the one hand, it is a enormous, at least it feels like an enormous, you know, uh, privilege, for lack of a better word. I know that word gets sort of like bashed a lot, but
Sure.
feels like an enormous, privilege, that a very fortunate situation to have this level of freedom over one's life. But at the same time, to your point, it comes with this enormous responsibility and this sort of pressure to make, make the most of those freedoms and make the best decisions. And the reality is that you can't know in advance like what the best decisions are, or there might not even be sort of like an objective best decision. And so you just sort of have to like, you know, do the best you can, or even more simply, just like kind of like do what you want, which I think is sort of underrated relative to, doing like what's best or what you should do. Just like doing what you want sort of gets, kind of ignored by a lot of people, or thought as something that's like maybe selfish, or something like that. But who's to say that that's not as good a guide as anything else? Just sort of like trusting your gut. Ultimately, it's can be easier said than done as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know an alternative to that, to be honest.
Well, there's definitely I mean, the
Yeah.
alternative to trusting your gut and doing what you want, I think, is frankly, I think most people don't do that. I
Okay,
think.
so I guess it's just more from my perspective. I've tried to do things in the past that other people wanted me to do, and I've just found that I'm incapable of doing that. So
Well, that's
I
good. That's
I
a
yeah,
if you if
I don't have a
if
choice. I guess personally, I've tried in the past to do things that other people wanted me to do, and I just repeatedly found myself in a place where everyone didn't like what I was doing, and I didn't end up liking any of the other people who told me to do these things. So I've found that the best way that I can survive is to do what I want that already works for other people, instead of trying to like, obviously I don't want to do just whatever I want and then it's not helpful, but hopefully whatever I want to do finds people who are already interested in what I am doing so that it works. Right.
Right. And then so the other thing, and I think that's great. I think that is pretty uncommon though, honestly.
Okay.
Like to
I don't know any other way. So
No,
I
it's great.
think, yeah, I haven't been able to figure out how to live my life by doing things that other people told me that I should do. I honestly, like, sometimes I wish I could, because it's brought me a lot of pain in life, in some ways, because, sort of lack of understanding or just not on the same page. So if anything, I think so, like there's been moments in my life, not like recently, but when I was younger, I was very frustrated because I just couldn't do this thing that like other people told me to do because I just couldn't bring myself to do it.
When you're talking about other people telling you to do though, is this like more of a is this like sort of going against the wishes or recommendations of like your parents or something? Because I mean that is one thing, or sort of like going against the sort of you know recommendations or suggestions or asks or whatever of authorities, sort of like one way, and then the more subtle way, which is I think closer to what we've been talking about, since the sort of defaults and the effort required to go against them. That's more so like that's like sort of the subtler version of just like the implied thing that you should do is the thing that everyone else does. So, for
Yeah,
example,
yeah,
if you're not making the choice to live in one place year round because you've sort of thought about and maybe experimented with other options, then that in my book somehow, to some degree is falls under the category of doing things the way that you sort of quote unquote should do them. Not that someone's telling you, hey, like go
yeah,
live in one place
yeah.
per year, but just, sort of following the
I,
norms or more of the default path.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think like I guess I realized this over time is like I guess most people just don't really think about
Yeah,
things
that's true.
a lot,
That's
right? Like
true. Yeah.
I guess I just realized that I just think through these things significantly more. Like I've been even my wife used to get upset because we would be going on a trip and then I'd be like, okay, we need to have a discussion about like what does it mean to like really travel, and she would just be like, I don't care, like just make the itinerary. So I've always been really like I need to understand, like I need to really know. I get kind of obsessive about these things, and I think that's I want to know, like, is this person what they're telling me? Like, do I really think that? Or if I do think that, then why? Like I really want to know. I want to get to kind of the root of things. And so, and I think I've just, this is just kind of how I am. And that's made me question things, I think, a lot more, and both implicitly and explicitly. I think, yeah, the parents part, I think, is interesting because whenever I've kind of made unorthodox decisions, I think my parents, in some ways, have made their unorthodox decisions. They both kind of left Japan and just kind of did their own things. And in general, they're very independent people. And, when I kind of told them, hey, I'm going to make these very unorthodox decisions, I think part of it is also probably, they're like that. And then also, I just kind of probably, it's hard to tell, but I probably grew up not listening to what they're saying anyway. So it's like, what's going to change at this point is my guess. But yeah, I think there's this sort of implicitly like you don't think about it too much, so you're just kind of following along, or you are actively and explicitly, saying, hey, I don't think this is like what I want to do, or but that's more rare. I think there's more just sort of like people just kind of do things because they don't think about them like very deeply.
Yeah, it's funny, when you said like you just kind of realize like most people just like don't really think about things. It's like in the
Mhm.
exact same words I've come to that sort of realization. And like after like a surprisingly long, surprisingly like late in life. Not, I mean, I'm 30 now, so it's like not like that late,
Yeah,
but like in terms like I didn't realize this 10 years ago.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's just you just kind of it seems reasonable to assume that everyone thinks about things. And then at a certain point, you just kind of realize like it actually doesn't seem that way.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
it's kind of like this shocking thing. And it's funny, I would say like maybe like a few years ago, I don't know if you would agree, but it seems like
Mhm.
around that time that this concept of like first principles started, or like first principles thinking started to like become, sort of like a hot term. And it seems to have kind of come from Elon, or at least the two, like
Sure.
that term and the fact that Elon using it sort of seemed to come around at the same time. I sort of associate the two. And that term, like I originally found it to be like kind of like cringe, or at least I just like didn't really. I just I sort of had an adverse reaction to it,
Yeah,
because it seemed like almost like virtue signaling for thinking or something. Like I don't
yeah,
know, I don't know if that's like the right thing, but I now I don't have a problem with it anymore. I basically realized that it's it basically just means like basically thinking, I think is so like actually thinking about things for yourself is so relatively unpopular that people had to come up with a word that actually just meant thinking, because the regular word thinking, like first principles thinking, became this sort of word that meant actually thinking about things, because the actual word thinking had sort of been like butchered over years to where everyone, uses the word like, oh, let me think about that. But like that actually doesn't mean that they're going to go think about it. That means that they're going to go like, ask their boss if it's right, or like something like, I don't
Right.
know, like it doesn't actually mean
Right.
thinking. So we needed this like first
I-
principles thinking, and we like sort of, pray at the altar of Elon or whatever, because
Sure.
he like actually takes, he actually just thinks about things like from,
Yeah.
what they
I,
call first principles, which is to
I
me,
think
that's just thinking about things, right?
right, and I think this idea of thinking about things to me is just you care about something and you're just so interested in it that you're essentially willing to spend time to really understand the web of idea. I think of like different ideas are kind of rooted in essentially in if you take one idea and you don't, like say this is like this. I think a good example is first principles thinking. If you take first principles thinking in sort of isolation, it's meaningless. But if you start thinking about it in the context of what does it mean, sort of like from a physics perspective, or what does it mean to really think through the ideas from, to kind of get to the root. I think I remember like one time I was doing a physics test, I think in like high school or something, and I love physics, but I also just like kind of didn't study for this specific test, and I just remember showing up and be like, okay, well, it's probably easy in the sense that I can probably like derive all the things from like F equals ma, so I'm not going to work too hard. Um, but it's the possibility that you can take this. Can you finding those things is a lot harder than utilizing as well. So, you know, can you like sort of think so deeply about how the universe works, or how kind of like things these different theories and concepts are put together? Can you come up with such a detailed understanding that you can see a pattern of how something might work? And even crazier if you can turn it into kind of like an equation, and or an idea that sort of really resonates with people. So I think in that sense it's just kind of, can you get so kind of deep? I think of first principles thinking more as this: you're at the edge of known sort of human knowledge, and maybe there's a bunch of people who are PhDs that kind of move things slightly forward if they're lucky. Most of the time it's garbage papers and whatever, that's fine. But beyond that, can you kind of start to make sense of the great unknown? Can you start getting into something that you don't really know how it works, and can you find a pattern, and can you kind of like bring into reality something that used to be kind of unknown but now is more known as a pattern, and can you use that to kind of do other things with it, and other people can do other things with it? um, that to me is like kind of these, it's almost like discoveries that you're making at the edge of human knowledge and humanity's capabilities. I think those are the most exciting things, and honestly that's the stuff that I'm excited about.
Yeah. So I want to talk about these things. I think this segues nicely into one thing that I know you're working on, and a couple other things that I'm not sure what the deal is, but like, they're in your Warpcast bio that I wanted to ask about.
Yeah,
I did give you the heads up. This is my lower prep podcast, and I think it's great for the
totally.
spontaneous conversations like the one that we just had, which I never would have like, had on my prep sheet. But it also lends me to just asking, dumb questions and sort of getting
Happy to answer them.
the raw version. So the one, the one question I just want to interrupt with before we move. So I think the two things that, I want to talk about the camera that you're working on, or about
Yep.
to launch, or actually open pre-orders for. And then I also want to talk about, in your bio, it's mentioned something about what autonomous vehicles or flying cars, stuff like this. I
Yep.
don't know how like sort of legit that is, but would love to hear about that. But before we get to any of those three things, how did the name July come about for your Warpcast handle?
Yeah, that's a good question. I just had it as my, well, so yeah, I just had it as my couple of usernames, like Discord and Telegram and other things. I just had it as July.
Was it
Um,
clean? Was it like clean on those where it was just July, or was it like July 346 or something?
yeah, just it's like July 3413 or something. One of those like Discord. I think this was before Discord
Right.
had username. So yeah, I did that for a while, and the reason why July, August was taken, I
Good
think
enough reason.
was the reason. Because I'm not even born in July, so I think that's kind of hilarious. July's not my real name, so I don't think
Do
it'll
you,
take like much difficulty to find out my name, and I frankly don't really mind. I'm not trying to be anonymous or something. It just sort of started out this way, and then especially on Farcaster, it just kind of grew. So I honestly don't know what to do with it.
I think what you're doing with it seems fine so far. Just being
Yeah.
yourself, and I just
Yep.
I now know you as July, and it's
Hmm.
there's this nice thing about Farcaster that it's relatively sort of like early enough still, and some of the early people have stuck around or whatever, that you've got a lot of like the top people on there with just like sort of these one word names that are like kind of like just good basic simple words that aren't necessarily names and are in fact like clearly not the person's first name, like
Right.
I don't know how many I could rattle off the top of my head, but
Six
um
is one that comes to mind.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, there's a bunch of these, and it just makes it kind of cleaner than having all of your like sort of digital friends be like, you know, uh, John O 746 or like
Yep.
whatever it is. So it's kind of cool. And it makes for just like a sort of a clean experience within the app to have like sort of these, digital friends with these clean, like sort of word names. And so anyway, don't need to linger too,
Agreed.
too long on that. But so can you tell me more about you know, the fairly intriguing bio of flying cars and autonomous vehicles?
Yeah. So my background is actually mostly in robotics. I used to do a drone startup probably over 10 years ago, and eventually led to doing self-driving cars. I did some work with autonomous parking garage robots, and other types of autonomous vehicles. What I was mainly at Kitty Hawk, which was a um, company building flying cars. It was started with Larry Page and Sebastian Thrun, the guy who started X, with which is now kind of the main project at X for a while was Waymo. Waymo got kind of spun out of X and became its own thing as a part of Alphabet. Now it's running amok in cities like San Francisco and Austin. Maybe people have taken it. It's pretty cool. If not, highly recommend the experience. It's definitely in the future. I think it'll just only kind of continue. So I spent a lot of time working a lot on. I think I was one of the engineer number 6, I think, at the Flyer program, building flying cars for probably half a decade in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I can probably talk for an hour just on that subject if you want to.
I'm getting like I don't know what the right word is.
Yeah.
I have some concern now because first of all, we've gone way over the scheduled time, and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
appreciate it. And so I have a hard stop in half an hour, and I'm like, man, we just opened up a huge can of worms that
Yeah.
I'm thinking as you're talking. I'm like, I could talk about the autonomous cars for at least
Yeah.
half an hour, and then you're just saying you could talk about the flying cars for at least an hour. And I'm like doing the math, and I'm like, there's just not enough time, and we haven't even
Yeah.
gotten to the cameras yet, which I know is another very interesting thing. So we can do a sequel at some point, hopefully. But
More than happy to
let's
do this.
start.
First of all, I've really enjoyed
There
this. More than happy to do it again at some point in the future. And I do have to go at my hard stop is at 11 PST, which is in 30 minutes.
Yeah, so same time. So we'll wrap it up
Okay.
before then.
Okay.
So one thing I'm curious about, and then maybe we'll go on the flying cars riff for a moment, but
Yeah.
just on the autonomous side of things, like you mentioned Waymo. Obviously,
Yep.
Tesla has been teasing an autonomous fleet for
Yep.
roughly 7 years or so.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I bought the stock in 2017 on the thesis that Elon was actually going to deliver on this thing that most people weren't
Yep.
expecting he would deliver on, which is to do to basically like, through software, just hit the on
Yep.
switch on like a million autonomous cars overnight. And at that
Yep.
time, the market cap of Uber was like, I don't want to get it wrong, but I'm like
It's
totally
like 50
guessing here.
billion or 60 billion or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to say it was like 1.5 times Tesla. I could be totally wrong. I believe it was at least more than Tesla.
It's
But again,
definitely
I
more than
could be
Tesla.
wrong.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was something like that. And so I was like, okay, here's a company that does they're selling cars, they're doing a bunch of other stuff. But separately, they're going to be able to like launch this autonomous fleet and basically should be able to like replace Uber overnight. And I was just like very bullish Elon. This is also the time of, I mean, everyone loves Elon. Not everyone loves Elon, but Elon is this, absolute force of nature today. And he was back then already. But like, it's hard to sort of rewind to that version of Elon. Like it wasn't at all the same as today. Wasn't even
No.
close.
No.
But he was, he was big, but like, it's just very different. And so I was like, believe him. This was also around the time of the 420 tweet. He said he had like this offer to take the company private at 420.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, the stock was at like, I don't know, 360 or something. And
Yep.
I believed him. And so I was like, okay, take a flyer here. And was really dumb and, sold that like way too soon. It did like a 25x, without the autonomous fleet or the acquisition, it did like a 20 or 25x over the next like 3 years. And I sold after
Yep.
like 2x or something.
Yep.
But
I did the same with
reason
Nvidia back in 2018. Yeah.
yeah, that
So,
one hurts.
yeah.
These are similar.
I was like pretty much every robotics slash autonomous company that I've worked on in, the past decade essentially has used NVIDIA GPU. And I realized this is like doing inference on the edge. NVIDIA is the only player. So I bought NVIDIA stock being like, oh, like they're going to do well. And that was like 2017 or so, or 2016, 2017-ish. And and then they did well. And I was like, great, I'm going to cash out. And that was just the start. So.
Yeah, that's, happens to the best of us.
Yep.
So anyway, the thing I mentioned, Tesla back then, what I've been excited about really since then is it was like that same year, I believe, they were starting to come out with these reports on how much safer autonomous driving, in their vehicles was versus human drivers. Like the accident rate was like, again, I don't want to quote exact numbers because I just really don't remember, but I believe at that time they were already significantly safer than human drivers per million miles driven or whatever. And there's some bias because, they're not driving like some of the edge cases, but within like the cases that they were driving, like highways or whatever it was, like way safer than human drivers. And at that point, we were like clearly, I know I thought like the autonomous driving was, the self-driving fleet was like coming, but it wasn't, there was no Waymos going on. Like we had very few examples of like, if any, of actual like cars on the street that are not like sort of for testing or experimenting, that were driving, freely. So I'm like, okay, these things are already this much safer and they're not even around yet. Like from my view at that point, I sort of came to this strong belief. And after a little more research, like I uncovered, road traffic accidents actually are like the leading cause of death for people between the age of like 5 and 29 or something. So basically like outside of, child morbidity. And then after the age of, it might have even been higher than 29, but like something like that, then you start to have things that are sort of either outlier diseases or, increasingly as you get older, age-related diseases. And so like for people who are not dying from like diseases of, there are things that happen when like you're a kid and, age-related diseases like road traffic accidents are actually like the biggest cause of death. So I was like, and this was actually interesting to track throughout COVID as well, because COVID was this thing that suddenly was killing a lot of people, including, at least according to, the, mainstream accepted numbers or whatever, like it's killing people, mostly old age, mostly preconditions, but also, regular people of, moderate age or whatever. And so comparing those to like the cars like that, when COVID was at its peak, more people were dying from COVID than the road traffic accidents, but it wasn't like by an extreme amount. And the road traffic accidents isn't like a pandemic. It's not something that we ever talk about. It's something that's happening like every year, all the time. And so I remember at that time I started to get pretty serious about this idea. Like not, not that obviously I haven't been working on it directly or anything like that as you have, but I was like, this should be such a high priority from like from a government point of view
Yep.
to not only not get in the way of companies like Tesla, which by the way, like several industries are highly incentivized to attack,
Hmm.
and so the government can either join in on that attack or help to counter it in some ways. But like basically, we should be doing as much as possible, whether not just for Tesla, but for Tesla and for Waymo and a
Yep.
dozen other autonomous driving startups to make sure this, not only is this technology not impeded regulatorily in terms of what they're building, and then in terms of actually getting them on the road and encouraging people to buy them and whatnot, like to the extent, like to the level that we do for electric vehicles, arguably times a lot more, because you're just every day that you're getting more autonomous vehicles on the street, assuming these sort of safety ratings are true, or these fatality percentages or whatever, like you're literally just saving lives, like a ton of them,
Yep.
every day that you're accelerating this path to an autonomous driving world. So I'm curious, if that was sort of like a mission driven element of your work with those companies, or if that was not maybe like the headline thing, but just in general, like, was that something that was on a lot of people's radars who are working in this particular space, or is
Um,
it less about that in particular?
I think it's a sort of definitely people are aware of it and people are it's sort of mission driven in that people are excited to do it. That being said, a lot of the folks that I've worked with are there because they just are really excited about technology, or they're just excited about the future that it brings, or it's sort of an extension of what they did as a part of
Right.
their master's or PhD. Generally, more robotics focused people, I think, also tend to be, pretty technical, and they're more interested in solving really difficult problems, I think. And that is a focus that, or that's kind of the goal that a lot of robotics folks share is how do we make this happen? Both from a technical perspective as well as from a business perspective. That being said, I
Right.
think every robotics startup or company that I've been part of, I want to say almost every company, and so far, TBD on some of them, obviously, they haven't really turned a profit, I think. I don't think any of them have succeeded. A lot of them failed. A lot of them or don't exist. A bunch of them are, yeah, I don't want to badmouth like existing companies, but at least Kitty Hawk is gone. And it's a testament to how this is still like a cutting edge thing. This is at the edge of what's possible. People don't know how to kind of make the unit economics work. Waymo is obviously starting to change that tide. But let's take a moment here thinking about how many billions of dollars were poured into Waymo to get to this point. The ROI is pretty bad right now so far. So
Right.
the challenge, don't get me wrong, the making it safer, those things are really good. And I think that's definitely one of the things that I'm excited about is people don't have to drive anymore. That being said, I also kind of have a separate feeling about, something like right before 9/11, there were reports on how a bunch of terrorists that were affiliated with Al Qaeda were going to take planes and run these sort of, large terrorist schemes on United States soil, which were, again, I'm sure the government gets these kind of things from time to time. For whatever reason, they weren't acted upon, right? But take a hypothetical scenario for a moment where this was actually acted upon. We wouldn't hear about it. These like numbers of lives saved, and no one would care. right? Because people don't know that it happened. And I do think there's this kind of funny element to saving lives that over time, I think it's honestly the same with things like technologies or improvements upon human like polio vaccinations or something. It's like the polio vaccinations are terrible, we should stop. But then if a polio outbreak happens, it's you kind of realize why it's actually there is benefit to like a polio vaccination. And I think it's kind of the same with autonomy. I could see it going that route where it's just going to become so normal, and then there's going to be these Luddites that are going to come out of nowhere and be like, "You just need to return to driving out, stick shifts." So there is also this element of it's probably also not, people are gonna. This is going to become a normal thing. It's just going to become accepted as this like everyday thing. But I think it's going to open up a new future. It's going to open up. I think the NHTSA is National Highway and Safety Association is the large amount of responsibility it's going to have is going to diminish because there's going to be significantly less accidents on the road. I think insurance is going to have to find other places to make money because car insurances are eventually going to be a thing of the past. I don't think immediately, but as all cars become autonomous, it's going to be very unlikely that accidents are going to decrease significantly. If you look at the Waymo safety reports, I think from a couple of years ago, most of the accidents that were caused that Waymo ran into was caused by other people, like a bus driver that I think didn't signal that they were getting out and got out and hit a Waymo or something. These are like unexpected human errors, and they're not like machine errors as much. And there will be accidents. That's not to say that there won't be. 100% there will be, but they'll be sort of more nuanced, I think. So anyway, there's a lot of interesting things I think that can come of it, and that's what I'm excited about. Is it sort of changes cars, and I think Elon, alluded to one of the things that I think is interesting is you start to have like parking garages and parking lots will be a thing of the past eventually as well, which can then be used to do other things with and repurpose it for different purposes, like walking and other ways to get around. So I think that's exciting as well.
Yeah, it's there's a couple things here, but one is to your point on like sort of maybe some of these people wanting to like go back to stick shift or more generally like non-autonomous vehicles like human drivers. On the one hand, it'll be sort of something that objectively can be like pretty countered in terms of it being good because we'll have the stats on like how many the accident rate of human drivers versus autonomous vehicles once autonomous vehicles like have enough miles under we already have them, but as they become even more prevalent, like the volume will increase and it'll be like beyond the shadow of a doubt. And also the rate the difference between the two in terms of like the accident rates or the fatality rates will be like even more extreme as the technology gets better. So it'll be like a very hard argument to make, but I do somewhat sympathize. Not that I agree with them because I don't. Like I said, I think that autonomous driving is like, people are excited about it for all the reasons you said. It's new. It's this big technical issue. It feels like the future and all of these things. But I think in the individual dimension of it as being a life-saving technology, like a significant one, I think that particular dimension is like very underrated to the point where, like you said, like people working on them aren't even really thinking about that, top of mind. They're thinking about this whole host of other things. But it's like a dramatic life-saving technology that I think we should, do everything we can to bring about as quickly as possible. The reason I say I could, so I'm all for it, but the reason I say I could sympathize is because like, the problem is you have these, these people who are like, well, the accident rate's a lot higher, but I'm an amazing driver. So, it's not going to happen. I'm not going to get in an accident. It's, the robots are better than the humans, but the robots aren't better than me. And I mean, the one obvious thing that they fail to realize is, not all accidents are your fault. And it's, it really only has to be like one person's fault. In some cases, I guess it could even be like nobody's fault if something like, some outlier event sort of occurs and it's just like an escape tool or whatever. Like a bridge collapses, like that's obviously no one's
bridge
fault.
Collapse, a magnetic storm, released from the sun, knocking like a huge EM pulse or something.
I have not heard
totally
of
not controllable.
I have not heard of that instance, to be honest, but that sounds pretty brutal and outside of one's control as well. So anyway, like I understand the argument, like who am I to say that, you're not a great driver and, you might be right that like if you do happen to be a person who is, it turns out if you could see the future, you do get in an accident in an autonomous vehicle. And it was, and like, whether it was the autonomous vehicle's fault or not, like that, let's just say you could just actually see the future and that was going to happen. And on an alternative path where you never participated in them and you were only driving yourself, that never would have happened. And as it turned out, if you could see that line of the future, you never would have gotten in an accident. Like that is
Yep.
a possible set of futures. Not that you could actually see them, but that is possible. And so you can't really tell someone like, hey, look, you are, absolutely and certainly wrong. But all it is to say is it's just like it becomes a very difficult argument to make. And it seems pretty objectively true that like it would benefit the world at large to have pretty much autonomous cars be ubiquitous.
I agree.
And so anyway, so that's one thing. The other thing I was going to say that's interesting is like you made this point about parking garages going away. And I think the general idea, I don't know too much about this, but the general idea is like you have a much higher utilization rate on cars if there's just these autonomous fleets going around. Like less people have to own them. It becomes less expensive for everyone. There's less traffic because there's less cars on the road. You don't need the parking garages because they're not dormant as much. All of these things, and also I think another one is like. That this can ultimately, like, not only does it change the design of a city or a town or whatever in the form of parking garages going away, but the streets themselves can change. Maybe you don't need these 7-lane highways anymore or whatever.
Yep.
And I was just in Florence and in Italy, and I was just sort of like noting that like this is a fully walkable city. Like I consider New York to be like fully walkable, and it was my sort of like home city growing up. And so I like New York was the city to me. And so when I ended up visiting other cities like later in life, I was like, wait, like all cities aren't like you can't just like walk everywhere within them. Like you have to like drive from one neighborhood to another. I didn't know that was like a thing. I didn't realize how unique New York was in that aspect. And I obviously like
very New York thing to say.
Yeah, well, of course. So Philadelphia is kind of like that as well. Boston's kind of like that. There's other cities that are like that, but LA is certainly not like
to
that.
The element that New York is.
Yeah, not to the extreme of New York. But LA is certainly not like that. Miami is certainly not like that, et cetera, et cetera. But Florence is like, I hadn't been there in a while, or just to Europe in general. And I was like, well, Florence is even like more so the case. Like not only is it a fully walking city, but there's not even any cars. Like there's the occasional car that like sort of needs to get into the city center for some reason and has to like weave through pedestrians in order to get to where it's going. But it's not at all a city that like within the city limits, or at least like the interesting part to walk around, like there's effectively no cars. And so there's modern examples of this, with like that city cul-de-sac. I don't know if you're familiar with, or not a city, but like a very small town sort of like startup project in Arizona. And that's just like sort of one example. I don't know. I've seen.
He's on Parkcaster as well, actually. I interacted with him once.
The founder?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize that. So like I'm generally supportive of what they're doing. I haven't like seen what they're actually up to in quite a while, or like the progress or anything, but the concept is cool. And that's just one example. There's another example that it's. I don't want to get like too much into the politics stuff. Obviously, we're talking about this on election day, so certainly we could go in on this stuff.
Day.
Yeah. But Trump brought, regardless of your political stances or whatever, Trump brought up this interesting idea, I thought, maybe like a year ago, where he was going to sort of like, or at least he was speaking about running this program where there's a lot of national land. I forget what you call it, national land. There might be a different word for it, but like
federal land.
Federal land that is basically just like national parks and whatnot. And we could certainly do with giving some of that to certain projects with like various objectives. And his thing was basically like host a contest for like submit your design for a new city of the future, and like we'll pick the top 10 and we'll give some funding, but like more importantly, we'll give a good amount of land, which is like sort of less of an active cost. And you can go and sort of like build, you can raise external funds as well. And then you can go and try to like build this city of the future. And I think that's really interesting, because you just have these cities like, Florence, obviously, was built way back when and adapted over time, but it never really needed to adapt fully, I guess, for having like a ton of cars going through the central city. And similarly, like you'll have all these cities which in an autonomous vehicles world in the US might sort of like no longer, like they might still work. Like I'm sure like New York will still work like quite well. But you might have, with the new sort of parameters on transportation and other things as well, you might have, new ways that you would go about designing a city, more optimally. And I'd be very curious to see how I think autonomous vehicles is one thing that could sort of insert a reasonably significant shift into like how you would go about that relative to, other technologies that have come about over,
Right.
in recent history.
Yeah, I do think like autonomous vehicles will be, in the same way that diners, American diners, were an innovation that were built upon new kind of innovation built on the side of roads that people could go into, or movies that you could watch with a car, those drive-in movies. I think there'll be all kinds of second order effects of autonomous vehicles made for cities, or cities that are made to support autonomous vehicles will have new kinds of interesting businesses and things built on top of it that will support sort of AVs by default. I think that's super interesting.
Yeah. So, I realize now we are coming up on time, and I'm remiss that we did not even broach really the flying aspect of the vehicle situation, let
Yeah.
alone the cameras. But I'm choosing to look at it with a positive view that we have a great excuse to do another one of these, and maybe we can do it after. When is, we can do a quick, informational detail on the camera situation. Maybe just like a 30-second thing on like, what
Yeah.
it is. And
Yeah. I
then
can do a plug if that's cool.
yeah, I understand pre-orders are out. Like, when do they actually ship? And then maybe we can do, a follow-up one of these after it's shipped and in some customers' hands. And also we can sort of put a book ear for that conversation to get into the flying cars rant as well.
Perfect. So I'm working on Faust. We're building these cameras that take verifiably real moments in the age of AI. So what that kind of means is generally, with the rise, kind of think, if you think about sort of how photography used to be, you take these sort of like photos, and there was a real copy that it would generate, and there was sort of kind of a real, it reflected reality. It was sort of taking and capturing a real moment. Over time, convenience, like having film and digital cameras and now social networks, and then now with the rise of generative AI, there's sort of all this, it's infinite space, infinite kinds of editing that you can do, and infinite kinds of images that you can generate. It's kind of hard to decipher what's real anymore. So we built this camera can we kind of like create a camera that captures, if you're watching like a live sports game and you kind of feel a tension, right? Are they going to win? Are they going to lose? Versus watching like a highlight and you're like, oh, I can just watch this on YouTube again. It's fine. There's a sort of difference between the tension, and can we bring that sort of same level of tension back to photos to make it feel real? Again, like it's a real moment. And that was kind of the question that we wanted to solve with this camera. How it works, again, we can get into it a separate time. And there's a lot to talk there. We're going to, this is sort of the first version. It's very beta. We will be shipping, pre-orders are open today. We will be shipping a device starting later this year, essentially, for domestic US orders. And we'll start shipping internationally early 2025. So yeah, excited to get it into people's hands. There will be a way to kind of use these verifiable real moments that are generated and plug it into, hopefully different interfaces, and we'll have an SDK and things like this that allow people to use these photos and to verify themselves should they choose to want to do so. So that's kind of a part of our longer term aim as well. And again, you can get more into this, but the gist is a camera that captures verifiably real moments in the age of AI that we're in.
Awesome. Well, appreciate the short version and looking forward to getting a longer version. One thing that I didn't really actually appreciate from like just sort of seeing the casts and everything and what was basically and also like the one-liner of real photographs in the age of AI or some I might have just butchered it a tiny bit, but like roughly that.
No, you got it.
Yeah, and so that like sort of one-liner led me to kind of miss this other element that's kind of interesting, which is it's not just real photo versus AI generated photo. It's also real photo without editing, which is like that is less of an immediate issue. Like I think the AI is more of like the answer to the why now, why it's like sort of more important to have this
Yep.
verifiability and authenticity like today. But it's even interesting, 5 years ago when, or any time before this, AI images where it's just kind of cool to see like, okay, this is actually just what the photo on this camera looked like. There's no,
Yep.
pressing there's now like, we went from like, you could put one of 7 filters on an Instagram image, like when we were in, I don't know, when I was in like high school or something, to now like there's just like they say they give you like a bunch of options for like all these different things to tweak, which is sort of when I like sort of tapped out on doing these things. And then ultimately it went back to sort of just like, okay, most simple possible version. There's just like this one button now on the iPhone that you just press and it just like makes it look better. And it's like, okay, like that's kind of interesting and cool, but like it's nice to be like, okay, any photo that comes from this camera is just verifiably unedited, no AI, reality as it is. It's a very cool sort of like I like things in this category that are sort of like the future enabling the past almost, where it's like a technology that actually makes things simpler. And so anyway, it's very cool. Look forward to hopefully talking about it more. But appreciate all the extra time you spent with me today,
likewise.
and really enjoyed the conversation. And we'll be in touch some more.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I feel like we could have spent another hour and a half talking about sort of a variety of different subjects. So I appreciate you going over time and talking about all these sort of different subjects and what felt like a short period of time.
All right, awesome. Well, we'll talk soon, man. Have a good one.
Okay, you too. Bye.
Bye-bye.